The storm had howled through the valley for 3 nights, tearing shingles from roofs and rattling the ancient shutters of a town that felt as though it had endured every season history could devise. On the morning the clouds finally broke, Matteo Fiorini limped along the muddy road with a cane in one hand and a battered leather satchel in the other, inspecting the damage. He was nearly 70, thin hair swept back, eyes the color of varnished maple, and hands gnarled by decades of carving wood that sang. The storm, he decided, had done what time had refused. It laid low the great silver maple on the hill above his workshop. Still, when he reached the fallen trunk, he placed a gentle palm on its damp bark, as if paying respect to an elder craftsman who had served until the final note was played. He did not have the strength to drag even a single log himself, and the few apprentices he had trained were now scattered across Europe, making instruments under shinier signs. Matteo sighed and walked back through the dripping streets to the cafe where he took his morning espresso. It was there he overheard 2 voices at the next table, one a harried mother, the other her teenage son who spoke in low, brittle syllables. "Do whatever you want," the boy muttered, eyes locked on his phone. "I told you, I'm not going back to that school." The mother's reply was a taut whisper. "Luca, you can't quit everything." Matteo recognized the timbre of loss in both of them. A musician knows when a string is stretched past pitch. A luthier knows when a seam is about to split. He sipped his espresso, then introduced himself, offering a business card with edges softened by years of pockets. "Signora, if you're seeking work for your son, I could use a strong back." Luca barely glanced up. "I'm not stacking shelves." "It's not shelves," Matteo said. "It's wood and music." The mother's eyes flared with cautious hope. "Just try, Luca. One morning. You love music." "I loved listening," Luca corrected. "That's different." Matteo nodded as though he understood the distinction better than anyone alive. "Nevertheless," he said quietly, "help me bring a fallen tree to my shop and I'll teach you something you can't learn anywhere else." The next dawn, Luca arrived beneath the tilted sign of Fiorini Luteria, waves of black hair hiding half his face. He wore headphones, but no music played through them. They were armor. Matteo handed him gloves and led him to the splintered maple. Together they sawed manageable sections, the blades singing a rough counterpoint to the chirp of returning birds. They rolled the logs onto Matteo's cart, Luca's sneakers slipping in the mud, curses muttering beneath his breath. Yet with each shove and heave, something in his shoulders seemed to unknot. Back at the workshop, Matteo pried open the shuttered windows. Dust motes spiraled in the early light, floating above benches scarred by decades of chisels. The air smelled of linseed oil and rosin, seasoned with echoes of Bach and Vivaldi that had been played on instruments birthed in this very room. Luca ran a hand along a rack of gouges and planes. "So you really make violins from scratch?" "Not from scratch," Matteo corrected, tapping a log. "From this." He split a length of maple with a mallet and wedge, revealing grain that shimmered like frozen smoke. Luca stared, involuntarily intrigued. "Doesn't look like a violin." "Give it time. And give yourself time as well." Matteo set Luca to removing bark, explaining that the back of a violin favored maple for its sturdiness and flame-like figure. Luca worked in silence while Matteo traced templates on aged spruce already seasoning on a shelf. Occasionally the old man hummed, and the boy's hands found rhythm in those wordless tunes. When noon arrived, Matteo warmed soup on a single-burner stove. They ate from chipped bowls while the logs rested near the stove to dry. Luca's eyes wandered to photographs on the wall, sepia images of concerts, smiling children, and one young soldier holding a violin amid rubble. Matteo noticed. That was me, 1945, he said. Music kept me intact. What happened to the violin? It survived, though not as pretty. Like some of us? Luca nodded, though the history of war felt remote compared to his current battle with school. Friends who had drifted, parents who spoke in shrill code words like intervention and motivation. Still, he was curious. How long does it take to make one? A lifetime, Matteo answered. Then more gently, but one instrument? A few hundred hours if the hands and heart are ready. The following weeks fell into unspoken routine. Luca arrived early, sometimes earlier than Matteo, and opened the shutters himself. Together they quartered the maple, selected the clearest pieces, and cut billets for backs, ribs, and scrolls. Matteo taught him how to seal the ends with wax, how to stack the wood so that air could circulate. Wood must breathe, he'd remind, like us. One Thursday, Luca found Matteo staring at a gouge, his fingers trembling. The old man smiled thinly. Arthritis, the price of devotion. He guided Luca's hands to the gouge. You'll need to carve the scroll. What if I ruin it? You will ruin the first one, then you'll make another, and eventually you'll forget which you ruined and which succeeded. They'll all teach you. Luca placed the billet in the vise, sketched the volute's curve, and set steel to wood. Chips curled away like shavings of white chocolate. The process required patience he didn't know he possessed. Hours passed. The scroll emerged, imperfect yet unmistakable, spiraling toward its silent center. Each step unveiled new mysteries, bending ribs over a hot iron without scorching, joining spruce plates so precisely the seam vanished, graduating thicknesses with a thumb's subtle pressure. Matteo's voice served as metronome, steady, spare instructions punctuated by stories of violinists whose artistry began inside this modest shop. A player feels the maker's touch, he'd say, pressing Luca's palm against the arching of a belly plate. So leave kindness in your curves. One afternoon they visited the cemetery on the hill to pay homage to the maple's stump. Matteo brought Luca not to mourn, but to listen. Wind moved through the standing pines, carrying a slightly different pitch from each trunk. Hear that? The old man asked. Trees have voices long before we turn them into instruments. We're merely translators. Luca closed his eyes. The wind-scored air resembled a whisper he had not noticed since childhood, a murmur beneath the noise of school bells and text messages and relentless self-judgment. For an instant he felt something settle, like dust landing on still water. Back in the workshop, Matteo drew a small folded letter from his satchel and placed it under a clamp for safekeeping. Luca caught the name scrawled across it, Elena. He thought of asking, but the old man began demonstrating purfling, the inlaid strips that border the violin's top and back. This, Matteo said, is the maker's signature, a concealed guarantee. If you rush, it cracks. If you honor the grain, it becomes a frame for the music. By early winter, Luca's hands were calloused, fingertips scored with fine cuts. Yet he returned daily, riding his bike through icy streets. His mother noticed faint traces of sawdust on his coat, the way he hummed unknowingly as he poured cereal. She once stood outside the shop window and saw him laughing at some joke Matteo told, a sound she had not heard from her son in a year. She wiped tears quickly and walked on, afraid to disturb the fragile chord forming. Inside, the violin lay assembled, its blonde surface awaiting varnish. Matteo unlatched a cupboard, revealing jars of pigments, amber, madder root, burnt sienna. He mixed resins into alcohol until the room filled with a smell like forest fire and honey. Color isn't just appearance, he explained. It's resonance. Too thick and the sound suffocates. Too thin and the wood bruises in humidity. They layered the varnish day by day, Luca brushing with steady strokes, Matteo rotating the body to catch sunlight. Under translucent coats, flames of the mapleback flickered, alive as the storm that felled its source. When it dried to soft gloss, Matteo fitted ebony pegs and carved a bridge. Strings extended from scroll to tailpiece, silent wires waiting to vibrate. But there was still the matter of the bow. Matteo opened a slender drawer and retrieved a bundle of horsehair. An instrument without a bow is like a voice without breath. We'll rehair one of my spares. He guided Luca through measuring the loosed hair, tying knots, and melting rosin to secure them. The process demanded meticulous counting. Exactly 200 hairs, no more, no less. Luca lost track twice and dumped the bundle to start again, teeth clenched in frustration. Finally, on a cold morning glazed with frost, they rosined the bow and tuned the violin. Luca lifted it to his chin. He had played a little in school orchestra years ago, long enough to grasp how far rust accumulates. His first note scratched, the second squealed. He reddened, lowering the instrument. Matteo held up a patient hand. Let her speak. She's newborn. She'll cry before she sings. They tried again. A G major scale wobbled but did not collapse. The wood reverberated against Luca's collarbone, an intimate pulse. Halfway through the second octave, a pure tone blossomed, bright like winter sun on snow. Luca's face altered as if remembering laughter from a distant room. Matteo closed his eyes, listening not to the pitch but to the healing embedded in it. That evening, as they locked up, Matteo pressed the folded letter into Luca's hand. Will you read this to me? They sat by the stove. Luca unfolded it carefully. The date read 20 years prior. The handwriting, flowing and sure, addressed Matteo with affection and regret. Elena, his wife, had written from a hospital where an illness was stealing her sight. She encouraged him to keep making violins because, in every one you build, I will hear you hold me. Luca finished reading, voice soft. Matteo stared into the stove's embers, eyes gleaming. I never answered her, he murmured. She passed before I could, but I kept making them, hoping she heard. Luca saw the old man differently then, not merely as a craftsman, but as someone who poured grief into forms that could be held, tuned, and given to the world. He thought of his own father, who had left 2 towns over with a new family, leaving conversations unfinished. The shared ache formed a quiet alliance between boy and elder. Winter's final days arrived laden with wet snow. The town planned a spring festival to lift morale after the brutal storm season. A small committee asked Matteo to display his instruments. He agreed on one condition, that his new apprentice would perform. Luca's protest died under Matteo's unwavering gaze. Music must leave the workshop, the old man said. Only then does it fulfill its promise. On the festival morning, Luca paced behind the makeshift stage in the square, violin trembling in his grip. He wore a simple black jacket and, tucked under the chin rest, a strip of maple bark from the fallen tree. Matteo stood beside him, cane planted like a baton. Remember, he whispered, the wind has already approved of you. When Luca walked onto the platform, chatter dimmed. He drew the bow across open strings. G, D, A, E, clear, stable. His mother, front row, clasped her hands beneath her chin. He began with a slow movement from Veracini, notes stepping like cautious deer. The violin's voice, his voice, floated beyond the cobblestones, curling around lampposts, slipping through open windows. Midway through, he closed his eyes. The square dissolved. All that existed was grain under fingertips and air set vibrating, each frequency a bridge to something larger. As the final chord faded, Silence held for a breath. Then applause erupted, raw and uncontained. Luca looked for Matteo, but found only an empty space. Panic flickered until he spotted the old man sitting on a bench removed from the crowd, tears streaking his lined cheeks, hands folded over his cane as if in prayer. Luca bowed awkwardly, heart pounding, then hurried to him. "You disappeared," Luca said. "I needed to hear from a distance," Matteo replied. "Here," he tapped his chest. "Not just here," he touched his ear. "And I needed to send that answer to Elena." He paused, chuckled. "Took me 20 years and a storm-felled tree." Over the next weeks, word of the performance spread. A conservatory professor requested to evaluate the violin, praising its projection and warmth, offering to buy it on the spot. Matteo shook his head. "Not mine to sell." Luca was stunned. "But I made it for your workshop." "To find your worth," Matteo said. "Now you must carry it forward." Luca stood, clutching the instrument that felt heavier with responsibility than wood could account for. "What if I'm not ready?" "You were ready the moment you listened to the wind." That summer, Luca enrolled in the conservatory's youth program, commuting by train with the violin case always at his side. Between classes, he returned to the shop where Matteo now sat more often than stood, instructing with gestures when words exhausted him. They began another violin from the remaining maple, this time with Luca guiding younger students who drifted in like migrant birds, curious, skeptical, hopeful. He repeated Matteo's phrases. "Wood must breathe. Leave kindness in your curves. A voice without breath." He even caught himself humming the old man's tunes. Late August, Matteo took to bed with a fever that clung like burrs. Luca visited nightly, playing quietly on the first violin until the old man's breathing slowed to sleep. One evening, Matteo reached for Luca's hand. "Promise me," he rasped. "Keep teaching." "I promise." Matteo passed before dawn. The funeral filled the church with music students, cafe owners, festival vendors, and strangers who had only ever walked by the workshop but felt its absence like a silent chord. Luca placed a single maple leaf atop the coffin. Back at the shop, dust lay undisturbed on benches as if waiting for orders. Luca set his violin case down, opened shutters wide, and let morning pour across chisels and planes. He lit the stove, filled a pot for tea, and pinned Matteo's sign, loosened by the storm months ago, firmly above the doorway. Outside, children laughed on their way to school. A breeze wandered through, stirring wood shavings to dance on the floor. He removed the second violin in progress from its cradle and pressed a palm to its belly. The spruce was warm, almost pulsing. Luca picked up a gouge, inhaled the scent of raw timber, and began to carve, the notes of his mentor's voice moving through his muscles. Each curl of wood fell like a syllable in an answer long delayed. In time, customers arrived, some for repairs, some to watch, some to learn. Luca greeted them with the reserve Matteo had once shown him, balancing humility with quiet pride. And on certain evenings, as dusk painted the valley in sonorous blues, he would carry his violin up the hill to the stump of the silver maple. There, standing where the tree had listened to countless storms, he played whatever came. Laments, lullabies, fragments of conversations he wished he had with his father, greetings to Elena, and sometimes a single sustained note that hung in the air until wind or memory carried it away. If you passed by then, you might have thought the music came from the tree itself, finally speaking through the instrument it had become, revived by the hands of a disillusioned boy and an aging master who believed, to his last breath, that sound could mend even the deepest fracture. And perhaps you would be right, for the story of wood, like the story of people, is never truly finished. It reverberates in whatever chambers remain. the hollow between ribs, the vaulted ceiling of the sky, inviting anyone willing to listen to add their own vibration to the timeless, trembling song.